You're right, it's Noah Vortex, and I thought I'd do another video about art, I guess. Just thinking about art again, and again, usual thing, just stream of consciousness, thinking aloud, no pre-planning, what can I bring to the table in terms of new ideas and thoughts and whatnot. So I like to think today in this vlog about the irrational in art. The irrational, so this would be something like the art of the so-called insane, and basically mental health themes in art, maybe also how art, modern art, contemporary art, has had a relation to the so-called insane. Now, insanity and mental health as a broad subject is huge, obviously. I mean, there's so many angles you can approach it from: the medical, the society, the model of how society disables people. Obviously, you got like anti-psychiatric approaches, something like R.D. Lang, where he would say that a lot of insanity is basically a sane reaction to an insane world. But anyway, I'm not going to go too much into all these different, ideas of mental health and mental insanity. I want to talk about it in relation to art. So, it's been a trend actually, really, since the early 20th century, for artists to seriously take seriously the art of the mentally ill and to almost seek to consolidate and get influenced by the work of traditional, what would be called now outsider artists, or people who have some diagnosable mental health problem and make art in one way or another. Obviously, there's obviously a lot of crossover. Like if you look at historical artists, a lot of them also had mental health problems. I mean, Jackson Pollock, alcoholic, had some serious other problems, probably like bipolar. Obviously, Vincent van Gogh had manic depression, probably, and epilepsy. Myself also, I've definitely dealt with mental health issues. I've talked about it quite openly on this channel. I have a diagnosis of bipolar. I've had that since I was like 17 or 18, 19, just basically around that age. And anyway, to carry on. So, as I was saying, I think the start of, I guess, like considering seriously outsider groups and sort of consolidating some of those influences into art probably started in modern art. I think really from with Dadaism, really. But Dadaism was in many ways an anti-art. It was like an anti-bourgeois art. It was a radical nihilistic art, really. Actually, there was deep nihilism. It was a response to the First World War, and just sort of howl in the dark about that war, or greatly influenced by that war anyway. Dadaism was often very purposefully ugly in its style, in a way I think, which probably was quite influenced by what you'd call like raw sort of outsider art. There's a certain brutality, maybe in some ways, or just some rawness. Not actually rawness would be a better word. There's a certain rawness to a lot of the Dadaists' work, and obviously in terms of medium and media that they used, that was blown open. They weren't really just doing easel painting. There was probably a bit of that, but a lot of it was performance, weird collaging, mixed media, bizarre mixed media. So like it was Dadaism actually I think it's often underestimated just how significant Dadaism is to the history and development of modern art. Well, probably not. I mean, everyone sort of realises that, people like Kurt Schwitters and Tristan Sarr and all these Dadaists, and Marshall Duchamp as well, of course. I mean, love him or like him or loathe him, Duchamp is a seriously important figure in the modern art in the 20th century. I mean, that's not even questionable, I think. Whether you like his work or not, Duchamp is a very important artist. I actually do like his work, most of it. I think, even though you arguably could say that he was the world's first recognisable conceptual artist, I think a lot of his work's really interesting. Like the urinal, I mean, it's a moment in art history, right? It's I don't think that. I don't know. I think maybe in some ways the joke was taken too seriously, but that's the joy of art. You can't control art. There's no point trying to control it, really. I don't think you can say this is good art and this is bad art. I think it gets into very dodgy territory when anybody tries to do that. So I won't. But anyway, so obviously the Dadaists then influenced the creation of the Surrealist group. And the Surrealist group, you could probably even make more of a direct link between madness, mental health, and their sort of aims, because the Surrealists were all about liberation of the unconscious, right? So directly influenced by Freud, really. Freud's ideas are hugely influential in Surrealism and the development of Surrealism as an art movement and tendency in Paris and further abroad as well, of course. So I mean, everyone knows sort of like Salvador Dali, but then obviously you got other figures in that movement. You got like Breton was basically the de facto leader, as it were. He was often called the High Pope of Surrealism. And Surrealism was directly influenced as almost like a direct lineage to Dadaism. And I can't remember, I'm a bit mixed up on lots of the timelines of this, but I know that Jean de Buffet also coined the terms art brut, which again is another it's another important phase in the development of the art of the mentally ill and fine art, contemporary art of the time, coalescing and mixing in some respect. So Jean de Buffet wrote about the art of the insane, and he tried to integrate it into his own work. And that was one of his concerns. Art brut, what would have been called art brut now is really just called outsider art. I mean, I want to just speak personally. I dislike the term outsider art. I hate that the art world thinks it needs to sort of categorize people as outsiders. I mean, so many people have mental health problems. If you look at historically, even very well established artists historically now have got, Vincent van Gogh's the obvious example, but even someone like Edvard Munch probably had a serious anxiety disorder in modern terms. Does that then mean he's an outsider artist? I mean, how do we define who's an outsider and who isn't? That's what I don't like about the label. I just think it's not really an adequate one, to be honest. It doesn't adequately sum up much, really. Outsider art, I mean, I get it on some level. It's saying these are society's outsiders who are making art on the edge, but then I don't know. I just find it. I'm going to use this term. I don't really like using this term, but it's sort of problematic in some ways. Sort of like, can feel a bit voyeuristic sometimes, something's been called outsider art, and it's almost like, let's go to the circus and look at the art of the mentally ill people, sort of thing. I find that very extremely problematic. Art, but I think it's probably better. But then also, then it's sort of, I don't know. Let me go on to something else now. Within the second part of this video now, we're talking a bit more about how I think visually, like in aesthetics and all that. Why I think also there's a link between the art of the mad and why sometimes, and painters who are looking for inspiration or new forms or whatever. So I think there's actually been some research done on, say if somebody has an illness like schizophrenia, which is a very serious mental illness. I mean, a lot of people would say it's like the cancer of mental health problems, or knowing people with it is very difficult to manage. But I think there was a high. I'm sure I read a paper on this. There was like an article. So I'm not pulling it completely on my ass. There is, within people with schizophrenia, they are more likely to see faces in random patterns. So, like, say for example, if I use one of those AI tools and I generated something completely random, and to most people who look incoherent, to a schizophrenic, they would be more likely to see recognisable patterns and shapes within that incoherence, which is interesting. And I think maybe possibly one of the only positives, if you will, from having a serious mental illness, whether it be bipolar, manic depression, whether it be schizoaffective, schizophrenia, is you have an ability to sort of generate visual imagery that is unusual, and that anybody who is functioning on a quote-unquote normal level would find difficult to do. I mean, often people say that schizophrenia is like if you want to emulate schizophrenia, just have an acid trip or something. Which is reductive, but I mean, that's definitely not completely true. But I think having someone who experiences hallucination obviously has access to a library of visual information, if you will, that your average person wouldn't. So that's why I think there's been this relationship, definitely, because especially obviously in the 20th century, artists were striving for new forms of imagery. They were striving for newness. Modernism was all about, it's not really going on anymore, but was all about grand narrative. There was all about trying to establish utopia. It was all about trying to establish newness. There was an obsession with the new form, the new world, a new something or other. That's newness in general, and artists weren't averse to that. The artists were involved in that process, so it makes sense that they would look. Obviously this happened with Picasso and the expressionists when they looked into African tribal art. And you could say that was sort of like artistic colonialism and sort of ripping it. But then all culture is influenced by other culture. I mean, that's my personal view on it. Anyway, when it comes to, I mean, I guess, is it a bad or a good thing if say for example like a Picasso or I don't know, like someone, any visual artist starts replicating or taking visual cues from mentally ill artists and such? I don't think so. Again, not really. I mean, what are you going to do? You can't legislate art. I mean, it's the whole point of it is that it has always been a melting pot of influences and different cultures. That's always been the amazing thing about it. It works all different ways. But yeah, I mean, at the minute, I think in some ways it's good where we're at now, because obviously understanding of mental health's got a lot better. There's a lot more programs, like institutional programs, that will run for people with mental health problems to really help them. It's used to, and art therapy is much more popular these days, and is actually taken seriously a lot more, which is good, obviously. I think it's not an unhealthy place for art. I think mostly in terms of mental health and art, then yeah, we've come quite a way. You know, and the fact that it's actually taken seriously, probably in some quarters, is good. Because probably you know, like people like Dubuffet or the surrealists sort of re-examining all this stuff, it would have probably just been seen as laughable or ridiculous, or, you know, it's just, it would have just been another stigma that people with mental health problems would have had to deal with. Having, you know, they would have not been taken seriously because of their mental health. I mean, you can still judge the work on its own criteria, but at least now you're probably less likely just to be prejudged because, I don't know, you have schizophrenia, or you have manic depression, or you have depression, or you have anxiety, or whatever. Like, you're less likely. Whereas back in even a few hundred years ago, people just, the insane were just the lowest of the low in society, really. So we've made progress. Possibly we have the Dadaists and the Surrealists and all these other avant-garde 20th century modernists, I think, in some ways to help to thank for that, to be fair. So I think they'd certainly helped make it more in the public eye for having these weird, quote unquote weird, but, you know, just unusual visual expressions. So, but then obviously the main thanks obviously should go back to the original artists who had mental issues, who made those visual expressions, if you will. I think I'll leave it at that. I've already talked for 16 minutes. Like and subscribe. If anyone got any idea for any more subjects I can cover, just let me know. That's that. Alright, in a bit.